Hey people, it's Joel for another book fair book week reading. Today I'm reading Justified. It's part of our Second Chance romance series. So I'm going to read chapter 1 for y'all. The house was spacious, the floors thick marble. Lisa looked over her shoulder, the handsome businessman from New York watching her every move. How men in their late 30s racked up billions of dollars was beyond her. But his means of making money wasn't the concern. She wanted him to spend it. As you see, everything is custom designed. It's a one of a kind. She turned and pressed her back to the counter, her white button-down shirt open at the top, just enough to show the curve of her breast if she turned the right way. The black pencil skirt fit like a glove, the red heels screaming of the dominance that pulsed through her veins. I can see that. Magnificent. He stopped in front of her, his voice low, his eyes hooded, dark hair barely touching his shoulders, looked too soft not to touch, his eyes blue like the ocean. She reached out and moved a lock of it from his forehead before he caught her wrist. The house is nice too. I assume that means you're interested? You assume right. She smiled seductively, moving away from him, her hip brushing the front of his slacks as she walked into the living room. You'll see that most of the rooms are open air, and the windows will run the length of the walls in most of the living spaces. She walked toward the back wall of the living room, pressing her front to it. She looked over toward him and slid her finger back and forth along the creamy white pearls that adorned her neck. When a storm rolls through here, there is nothing more beautiful than watching nature in all its majesty. I can see how you'd be drawn to it. Most women fantasize about making love in a storm. Making love? I'd much prefer the other way to say it. She licked her lips and looked out the window. He took the last few steps between them, stopping behind her as she ignored him. The scene beyond the glass was picturesque. Her own house was just across the beautiful bay that spanned out before her. Her friends probably already drinking a glass of white wine while fixing dinner. She needed to hurry home, but the cell was imperative. He slid his hands along her waist, moving up to press himself to her back. She pressed back against him, moving her hips slightly. Do you have someone to go home to, beautiful? Not at this moment. She glanced over her shoulder, the handsome billionaire slipping his hand into her hair and lifting her face to his. She turned with his efforts, closing her eyes just before his lips pressed to hers. The burn of desire washed over her. The smell of his cologne reminded her of Mark. She slid her arms around his neck before realization pulled her from the moment. He groaned into her mouth. His hands moved to cup her, and he tucked her against him. She responded with a soft sound of appreciation for his aggression. Lust was beautiful and powerful, sustaining every need until you meet the one. Mark. Spend the night with me. He moved back, his eyes moving across her face, expecting a positive response. She wanted to. She needed to. Every time she had been close to giving herself to someone since Carrie's brother Mark left, it fell flat. She couldn't go through with it. She needed to get over him. Mark and her hadn't even slept together. It was safer that way. Not the night, but the next few hours. I have guests coming over this evening. Are you a married woman, Mrs. Sparks? Wouldn't you like to know? She smirked and pulled from him. Walking toward the bedroom, she paused just inside of it, bending over to slip her feet out of the 2-inch heels that made her feel far too sexy for her line of work. Showing bedrooms to men for a living was sure to keep her unmarried and a complete nymph. She turned as he walked in, the soft growl on his tongue, lighting a spark in her stomach. He wasn't Mark, but none of them are. Time to move on. She held up her hand to stop him for a minute. First things first. You buying this house? You live close? I do. I'm buying this house. Good. She walked toward the bed, stopping to pull the paperwork from her briefcase. Sign in these 3 places, and I'll not talk business again. Promise. He smiled and pulled a pen from the inside of his jacket pocket. His clothes screamed money, his body sex. She took a tentative step back as he turned and pressed the paperwork to the wall. Something buzzed inside of her head, a warning bell, that sleeping with him might not be the best of choices. She ignored it, grumbling as the thought of Jake and Carrie being together. She was more than glad her best friend found someone as great as Jake, but half the reason she had rented the house from him was because she could easily see the 2 of them naked and sweaty. Those thoughts were long gone. Jake too much like a brother, and Carrie far too important to her. What were you thinking about? He turned and let the papers drop to the ground as he worked on his tie. How much I was going to enjoy ruining you for all the other women. He laughed, the sound rich and thick. She liked him and could do this. She tugged on her pearls, the clasp made to give way at the slightest tug. They pulled from her neck and dropped from her fingers as he took the few steps remaining between them and leaned down to kiss her. She lifted up on her toes, pressing her lips to his as she swatted his hands away from her shirt. Taking the task on herself, she worked quickly. His jacket pushed from his shoulders, his shirt soon to follow. God, you smell good. He whispered against her mouth, reaching out and pulling her flesh to him. He pressed his tongue into her mouth, Lisa taking time to softly suck at it as she worked his pants open. He groaned as she released his tongue, moving from him and walking toward the bed. Come here. She undid her shirt and slipped out of it, her black hose held up by garters. She looked over her shoulder as she unbuttoned her shirt and threw it across the room. Damn. He moved toward her, leaning over to pull his shoes and socks off his slacks. He tugged his underwear off, leaving them on the ground. She left her back to him, her heart pounding in her chest. Lisa hadn't been with a man in far too long. She had almost made it there, almost let them take her to a familiar place, and then... No. She whispered to herself, sliding her arms across the bed and lifting her body to him. This one would be a go. She would just pretend it was Mark. No. She grumbled louder. No what, babe? The handsome man behind her pressed his lips to the back of her thigh as he knelt beside her. No, don't stop. She pressed her face to the mattress, fighting the sensation that it wasn't right to sleep with someone else and desire another. Bastard. She growled against the bed, knowing nothing would come of it with Mark. He was back in New York and several years younger than her. He was in college and she was a grown woman. Her panties were being pulled off slowly. She bent her knees and slightly pressed back. Her body was more than aware of how to handle the pleasure. Okay, pretty girl. Lisa pushed her hands against the bed, gripping the sheet as she groaned. They were too far to go back. It was too good to want to. He sighed deep in his throat and began thrusting. The sound and smell perfect. So good, she whispered, losing herself in his moments. He knew what he was doing, his experience pulling her from her worries over what was right and what wasn't. Mark and her were nothing, nor would they ever be. An image of the sexy rebel rushed across her vision. The handsome billionaire became Mark in her head. her body giving way for something so far beyond right that she treasured it. "Mark," she said. Hands slid around and cupped her breast, squeezing softly before kneading them. She placed her hands over his. Bowing her head, she gave him access to her, all of her. Whatever he wanted, she bowed down and offered herself. He rocked against her, his breathing heavy. Why had she denied herself when she was so close? When he was so close? Why hadn't she forced them to explore what they could be? The thrusting stopped. The hands slid away from her. She leaned across the mattress. "Damn, that was fantastic." His voice was thick, shattering the last bit of fantasy. Lisa steeled herself, standing up, turning, a wicked smile on her lips. "Good. The house is yours. And you have my number. Don't be a stranger." She walked to pick up her clothes and down the hall to another bedroom to dress. When had all this fallen apart? Sex was her favorite pastime, her go-to workout, her most comforting activity. So what if she had more testosterone than a 15-year-old boy? She was in charge of herself and only had to answer to one person. Me. She glanced at the mirror, tugging at her hair and fixing her pearls. Lisa finished dressing quickly and walked out with her head held high. She wasn't ashamed of having a stranger or doing it for a quick sale. She was mortified that she needed Mark in the middle of the activity to feel anything. Bastard. She grumbled and walked out of the house, her signed contract in the bag, and a bone to pick with the man that crept into her heart and never once touched her. Complete bastard. There it goes. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're enjoying Book Fair Week. And like, subscribe, and have a good one.